This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. He was a Zelig type, a fool, a trickster, a black magician, a charlatan, a genius, a fabulist, a guru, a junkie, an alcoholic, a secret agent, a police informer, a disruptor, sex man apparently, though he didn't understand love, psychopath. Nope, that's not me, I'm Stephen Coates, and it's not our guest, Andy Roberts, psychedelic historian. It is Michael Hollings. This is the second part of a psychedelic trip through the life of the man who turned Timothy Leary onto acid. The man who turned on the world, as he immodestly described himself, but we will know him in this episode as the Divine Rascal, and that's the name of Andy Roberts' biography of Michael Hollingshead. A wonderful read is available on Strange Attractor Press. Michael Hollingshead, born in the industrial north of England in the town of Darlington. An abusive childhood, but transformed himself miraculously through his teenage and early 20s into a character who was to go on to make psychedelic history. After his time in England as a young man, he ended up in New York, where he became one of the first people, and certainly one of the first English people, to abuse acid, LSD. This is in the early 60s. He went on to turn on various people and ended up meeting Timothy Leary, and after threatening to commit suicide if Leary did not meet him again, he managed to end up as his kind of babysitter, factotum, secretary, living in the top floor of his house with a mayonnaise jar full of acid, which he doled out to anybody who was keen, eager, foolish enough to accept. And eventually, after some reluctance on Leary's part, he persuaded Tim Leary to take it himself, and Leary's mind was completely blown, and American social history, psychedelic history, world history possibly, was changed, transformed, part of the great psychedelic wave, the great countercultural wave which swept across America east to west, and of course swept across the lands in this side of the Atlantic too. And we left Michael Hollingshead and Andy, as Hollingshead himself was on a boat across the Atlantic back to these shores, sent by Leary, possibly to just get rid of him. He was a very difficult character, and we're going to find out much more about the Rascal side of his character in this episode. But apparently, really, ostensibly, to create a psychedelic beachhead in London. That was the idea, where Leary would come and join him after a certain amount of time and carry on bringing the good work, the good acid work, preaching the acid religion to the denizens of this country and of Europe. And what we'll hear, Hollingshead is about to set up something called the World Psychedelic Centre in 25 Pont Street in Chelsea. So Andy, welcome back to the Bureau of Lost Culture for part 2.
Hi there.
We left Hollingshead on that boat crossing the Atlantic from New York to London, carrying with him lots of acid and copies of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and various other psychedelic paraphernalia. What happened when he got here?
Hollingshead landed in Southampton. He was picked up at the docks by his millionaire friend Desmond O'Brien, who'd been across to America a few times to see him. Desmond O'Brien took him to London, put him up in a hotel for a few weeks, paid all his expenses, and there are letters between Leary and Hollingshead where Hollingshead is saying he can't believe how fantastic Desmond O'Brien is because he has access to loads of drugs, he has dolly birds visiting him 3 or 4 at a time, he was living the high life, and he was going to fund the World Psychedelic Centre in London, which Leary was very pleased about. And so it came to pass in late 65, just before Christmas, Desmond O'Brien signed a lease on a flat at 24 Pont Street, which I think was a second floor flat, and that became known as the World Psychedelic Centre. Hollingshead moved in, and it was all decked out with, the usual posters, lush carpets, fantastic sound systems, and it was going to be a place to trip in. And Hollingshead, in his autobiography, writes about trips there which were very, very structured with, done exactly as Leary talked about it. And he was putting out pamphlets to London's psychedelic community that already existed, sort of saying, this is how it should be done, blah, blah, blah. Now, I've interviewed several people who were already practicing acid heads in Britain in the sort of 63, 64, 65 time, and they didn't want that. They weren't interested in it. They were into acid in their own way. It was a bit spiritual and religious, but basically a lot of people were just doing it for a lot of cosmic fun. It was just amazing to do. It was an amazing experience, and they resented it a little bit. And Hollingshead couldn't really get his head around this until he met a guy called Joey Mellon, who is better known as being the partner of Amanda Fielding, who was the first person in Britain to self-trepan herself, i.e. drill a hole in her skull, which was supposed to raise consciousness.
Right, I mean, I've met Joey, a very, very nice guy. He trepanned himself too, and wrote the book Borehole about it, also published by Strange Attractor, I think. But let's go back to O'Brien a moment. So I've got a photograph of him here in front of me, and very urbane, British-looking, posh. Lloyd's underwriter, as you say, old Etonian, with his cigarette and his tie. Not the sort of typical psychedelic character, you'd think, really. A strange companion, possibly, for Hollingshead. But there they are. They've got this place, the Psychedelic Centre, in Belgravia in Pont Street, posh address, very posh address now. And here is what Hollingshead said about it in his autobiography, hagiography as you call it. I became the leaseholder of a large, comfortable Chelsea flat. With high ceilings and thick walls, it was here we opened the World Psychedelic Centre with Desmond O'Brien, and later Joey Mellon, as you mentioned. Also ex-Eton and a graduate from law as its vice president. We had lots of cushions, some excellent tapes and hi-fi equipment, a slide projector and several chillums. We began shortly before midnight, moving into the new temple room with a kind of piety and seriousness you find in acts of faith, when we all took our place in the magic circle of liberation. After a short silence, we passed around the bowl containing grapes impregnated with acid, about 300 micrograms, or what's considered to be relatively high dosage, likely to last from between 8 to 12 hours. The sympathetic discharge would follow in about 40 minutes. I assume by that he means you start to feel the effects, right? Indicated by enlarged pupils, rising body temperature, increased heart rate, variable blood pressure, and sometimes a moderate amount of physical trembling. I love this line. Yet they are no stronger on the body than the effects of a game of tennis. Only thinking makes them so. I love that. I play tennis. I don't quite get that comparison. The writing goes on. It gets more and more sort of florid and cosmic. And they start reading from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He's talking about this snake uncoiling, it feels like you're a snake crawling into a hollow tube, gathering in force and intensity. But it is all quite formal and planned and Leary-like, I suppose. And I think what you were saying earlier about for the Brits, they're a bit more like Ken Kesey in a way. They were like, hey, this thing's cool, and it, you see loads of weird stuff and it's fun, let's just do that. We don't necessarily want somebody coming in telling us how we've got to do it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the early acid users in Britain were spiritual and religious, but not in that formal way, whereas Leary was sort of very insistent about it, and he was also very insistent about, you must fast for a day before and everything. Now, a lot of the British people have said, well, no, why would you do that? Because all that means is you're going into a trip extremely hungry with low blood sugar, and you could quite easily freak out. And it was Joey Mellon who, sort of had introduced the idea via his mentor, the Dutch guy Bart Hugers, who was the first person to start trepanation, that you should take a lot of sugar when you were taking LSD, and that stopped you freaking out. And slowly... Is
that true, Andy? Is that just as a sort of technical point? I had this in my notes here just to ask you, because I know you know this stuff. Is that the way to avoid a bad trip? Is to have a Mars bar?
It certainly helps. And I mean, when I was a teenager, the older people I hung around with always used to insist that I ate lots of sugar whilst we were tripping, and it seemed to sort of work. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know the chemistry of it all, but it became an accepted thing. And also, basically, just sucking on a barley sugar when you're tripping gives you something to do, and it can take your mind off anything bad that might be happening. But I think keeping your blood sugar up is a good idea, because even when you're not high, if your blood sugar's low, you can get very jittery, very agitated, agitated and things can start to fall apart. So, add 300 micrograms of good LSD to it and you're in a hiding to nothing. So Hollingshead slowly took up that idea and had bowls of sweets all around his flat so that people, could, and fruits so they could take oranges and so on and so forth. And so what happened over about 2 or 3 months was that it was a really interesting place. There were lots of people coming to the World Psychedelic Centre. Hollingshead gives a list of them in his autobiography, and he includes famous people like Donovon and lots of other famous people. Some of those people went, some of them didn't. Paul McCartney certainly went, and Paul McCartney's I can't remember who was with him, but one of Paul McCartney's friends was with him and tried to drag him away because he thought Paul was being brainwashed by Hollingshead's blood sugar idea. And Hollingshead had these charts up on the wall showing about how changing your blood sugar helped you stay high and helped you not get a bad trip and so on and so forth. So there were lots of visitors, but also what happened was it became a bit of a party house. People were turning up at all hours of day and night, tumbling out of taxis, tumbling back into taxis in a stone state of mind. And although the upper class people in that area were used to people having their own existences, it became a bit of a bawdy house, and it came to the attention of the police. Now, in January 1966, Hollingshead was arrested for possession of I think it was cannabis and morphine. He didn't tell any of his friends about that at the time, and he was bailed to a date in early March. But things are spiralling out of control to the point where I think on the evening of, I think it's March 4th, there were 6 or 7 people hanging out at Hollingshead's flat, Hollingshead included, when a couple of guys came in. The door was always open, and said, can we score? And Hollingshead said, yeah, go in that room there, and sent them into a room where Joey Mellon was, and Joey got out a lump of hash to sell them, and these people revealed themselves to be policemen. Basically, Hollingshead had got no security measures at all. They were just far too trusting. So Hollingshead and several other people were hauled off to the police station and charged with possession of cannabis and a few other drugs, but not LSD. Mainly because, firstly, LSD wasn't illegal at that time. It wasn't a controlled drug yet, so people could possess it. But also because the police didn't know what they were looking for, because it wasn't a high-profile drug, and a small thin glass bottle of clear liquid wouldn't have attracted their attention. So they missed all the acid that was there. So Hollingshead.
Also, I think that the significant thing about this, because this is March '66,
yeah,
and you've highlighted that that's the very month that London Life, which is this magazine of the sort of swinging 60s, publishes this piece, LSD, and it's on the cover. It's a big piece. I've got it here, and it's written by the editor. He says, "What I've learned of the potential of the drug LSD is frightening. The telephone threats I've received are not, and I consider it the duty of London Life to publish the following article in the public interest." And it goes on, and it's a fairly substantial piece written by a journalist who've been to the Psychedelic Centre. There's a extensive sort of interview with Desmond O'Brien, who, as you point out, is calling himself Mr. LSD. Probably not the best thing to do, right? Sort of hubris mixed with sort of foolhardiness, right? Mr. O'Brien, 39, tanned with grey-white hair. And sort of bragging about the whole thing. The article itself is quite alarmist, and I think you point out in the book it also seems to be the source of many of the rumours about acid, which probably not true. There's this whole thing about dumping it in, you could dump it in the water supply system and take out a whole city. And I think you point out that a lot of the prejudice or lots of the misinformation about acid kind of starts here,
yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely. Basically what had happened there, by the time that the London Life article came out, Hollingshead had gone on the run because he'd skipped his court appointment, and he didn't know it was going to be happening until he saw it advertised on the side of a London bus. And Hollingshead was appalled when he read it, because he hadn't sanctioned the interview. It had just happened because somebody had got in touch with Desmond O'Brien. And as you say, it opened the floodgates for prejudice, because it went on about being able to control an entire city by putting LSD in the water supply, which you can't do. That is just chemically not possible. But but it's the sort of thing that gets into people's consciousness, because it means that a small thing can affect a big thing, i.e. society, and people didn't like that. A couple of days later, the Sunday People and the News of the World both ran huge spreads on the Pont Street flat and what was happening there, and they really made it sound like it was going to be the end of civilization as we knew it if it got out into the streets, which it polarized the whole thing about LSD, because young people reading it were reading it and thinking, yeah, we're having some of that, we're going to London town now, and it really spread the word about acid round. But yet your traditional Daily Express and Daily Mail readers were, sat eating their buttered toast in the morning and spluttering about the downfall of civilization as we know it through, chemicals coming from America. So that's really what kicked it all off.
Well, I mean, as I was saying earlier to you, the London Life has sent this reporter in, Hugh Blackwell, to the World Psychedelic Centre to experience it for himself. Quite right too. That's the way to find out about it. And he says, I was given the drug from an eyedropper. There were 4 or 5 middle-aged people in the room drinking tea, watching me. That sounds a bit alarming. But then he says that he was still recovering 12 hours later. He said that I seemed to forget all the knowledge I'd ever acquired consciously, and I felt my subconscious released. I got a kaleidoscopic maelstrom of images rushing through my mind, a feeling of explosion in my brain. I felt totally out of control. There was a feeling of enormous forces of the universe pressing down on my head. I remember shouting, "Where's the antidote?" when it hit me. But then after this, it goes on to say, that's all quite alarming and stuff. And then he says, I felt I was totally telepathic. I felt like I could manipulate people. Use it in the right way. You could build a race of beautiful people, a whole new society, take it onto the moon, and you would have the whole universe at your command. I mean, you can just imagine kids around Britain thinking, I want that, right? I mean, it's not going to put you off, is it? O'Brien, in the same article, they keep going back to the fact that, understandably, that he is an unlikely-looking acid guru. He travels frequently to the States. He says, I've taken it many times, but the last time was more than 3 months ago. It's not addictive. As he says, as he relaxes in a black silk shirt and cream cord slacks, sipping a glass of whiskey. I took a leading part in he talks about it, and then he talks passionately about the drug, and he's an athletic-looking man and well-spoken. He told us that he had an associate with whom he would have to confer before answering some of our questions, such as, where do supplies of LSD come from? How much is there in Britain at the moment? How and where it is made? Can't answer those, old bean, he said with a smile, until I've discussed it with my associate. I presume the associate is Hollingshead, right?
It would have been, yes. But by that time, by the time that was published, O'Brien and Hollingshead had lost contact completely, because Hollingshead was on the run driving around Britain, trying to avoid the court cases that had come up. And in the event, it got to May 1966, and Hollingshead skipped London completely and went to Sweden. And there's an apocryphal story that Scotland Yard detectives, he was arrested in Sweden on another drug charge. Scotland Yard detectives were sent to bring him back on an aeroplane, and he managed to secrete some acid under his fingernails, which he got into their coffee whilst on the aeroplane. So when it landed at Heathrow, he just got up and walked off, and they were bewildered and befuddled, and he handed himself in a few days later after he'd tied up various loose ends. So in the middle of May, he was in court for these various possession charges, and he got sentenced to I think it was 18 months in prison, and he spent.
But you said that he defended himself whilst he was on acid.
Yes, that's what he says, and I mean, we've only got his word to go on for that, but it's the sort of thing he would probably do, because he was so arrogant and so self-assured that he probably thought that he had a better chance of defending himself than than any legal representation. I mean, it didn't work, did it? But he tried.
Well, I mean, people have often tried to defend themselves for various reasons, which is possibly foolish, but you can understand it. But then to do it on acid, it just seems like, who would want to go in a court in Britain on acid anyway? I mean,
well, you see, that's a measure of Hollingshead's ability to deal with the acid experience, that he felt confident he could go into, something as physically and mentally oppressive as the Old Bailey, I think it was at, and and put up a good show in front of the prosecution legal people. But in the end, he got sent down, and he served 18 months, some of which was in Wormwood Scrubs. And again, in his autobiography, he tells this story about how George Blake, the guy who was arrested for spying for Russia, was on his wing, and he turned George Blake onto acid whilst he was in there.
How?
By giving him acid, basically, because they had free association on Sundays where they could mix liberally between cells, and Hollingshead was getting acid sent in the form of injected grapes or in ballpoint pens and so on and so forth. So the acquisition wasn't difficult, and he'd been telling lots of prisoners about it, and he says he tripped with some people there who he trusted, and George Blake heard about it and asked if he would trip with him. The trip wasn't very successful from Blake's point of view because he was a bit paranoid, but if true, I think that's quite an interesting story.
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose the one place that I would be less likely to do acid than the Old Bailey is actually in Wormwood Scrubs. I mean, that sounds terrifying. Let's just dig into his character a bit before we go on, though, Andy, because all this is going on. He's been on the run, he's dosed policemen. So the one part of your narrative too is that he was a fabulist and a liar. So, we have to sort of take his word for these exploits to some extent. So some of it obviously you've verified. But this commitment to the drug, and it is a drug which is generally regarded as not being addictive, so not physically addictive, and yet the commitment to it, which means that he's always got it with him, gets it sent to him, he gets it, he has it on the plane, he has it in court, he takes it into prison with him, he gets it sent in. And why was he so committed to it? I mean, what was it about acid that he had this kind of such a intense, intimate relationship?
That's hard to pin down, Stephen, is that? But I think he just saw it as being the ultimate transformative experience that could be applied to any situation, as mundane as being in prison or in a court, or out in the mountains in Mexico where he took it a lot, and it just changed things so fundamentally. And because he was so adept at the experience, he saw himself as a guru. And I think one of the things that I've tried to get in throughout the book is that he was always in Leary's shadow. I think he always wanted to become Leary and have that sort of fame and power and influence, but his personality fundamentally argued against it. So he was sort of caught, where he had to try to be this sort of acid guru, but he could never quite become a popular acid guru.
So he craved the status and fame possibly that Leary had.
Yes, and the respect and all the doors that sort of thing opens to because he never had any money. Money was a constant source of problem in Hollingshead's life. He certainly didn't like working for money. So he wanted it to be given free, and his way of getting it free was to become involved with people with money, and who would fund his experiences, which happened over the years on and off. But every now and again he had no money at all. So he saw the sort of guru trip, if you like, as a way of securing a comfortable future during which he could do as he pleased, and he'd have lots of acolytes around him.
And yet, you've said, and you've reported that Joey Mellon had said about him, that he didn't understand love. And, maybe that's part of the sort of sociopathy or whatever. But, of course, acid became the fuel for the summers of love in the US and the UK. And of course, for many people, acid was about love, wasn't it? It was about that sense of expanded consciousness, empathy with other people, community, and transforming society through those things. And yet, in many ways, that wasn't part of his thing, and maybe that's why he couldn't become somebody like Leary, because he didn't sort of have that feeling.
Yes, he definitely didn't have that side to his personality. He wrote about it intellectually as though he understood it, but his practice, his behaviour in everyday life didn't reflect that he sort of got the whole love experience. I mean, his history with women is quite appalling. To say he wasn't a particularly physically attractive man, he had a never-ending list of girlfriends and partners throughout his life. He didn't go without partners. I think people liked him because of his wit and his intelligence and all those things. But when people got involved with him, they saw a darker side to it. And he was he could be quite violent to his first wife, who Sophie, who was the mother of Vanessa, and he had lots of affairs when he was with her. And that pattern carried on with all his partners throughout his life. And in fact, one of his partners, who I won't name, ended up in a for want of a better word, a mental institution, and the person that visited her there found her crawling around on the floor, gibbering like a snake, and that was as a result of Hollingshead's. These days, I think we'd call it coercive control. He was very much into mind controlling the females that he was involved with, and there are only one or two who sort of escaped that fate, if you like.
Let's go back to him in Wormwood Scrubs, and of course that is the year, later on that year, possibly as a result of the stuff that's gone on, possibly as a result of the article in London Life and then in the News of the World, etc. Acid in the autumn is made illegal, isn't it? And so in some ways he got off quite lightly, didn't he? Because 18 months for skipping bail and getting caught with all those drugs and stuff was probably quite a light sentence compared with what it could have been later, right?
It could have been, yes, absolutely. And the irony is that he was in prison for the 2 Summers of Love, 1960 and 67. So he actually missed all the huge explosion on the streets, as it were. But whilst he was in prison, he wasn't idle at all. He was writing letters every day. He was very involved with Joey Mellon, and he was writing this sort of stage version of a psychedelic version of Milton's Paradise Lost. He was generating loads of poems which he was sending to Leary, which he hoped would be published, and sort of making plans for when he came out. Now, during this time, Leary had gone cold, and he hadn't sort of been writing to him, I think because it was the Summers of Love and Leary was too busy. So by the time Hollingshead was transferred halfway through his sentence to an open prison at HMP Layhill in Gloucestershire, where he it was a bit like an episode of the old British sitcom Porridge, where he was sort of pretty much in charge of the rest of the convicts there, because he was very, very clever. He knew how to manipulate people through his cleverness. So he helped people write letters, and they did him favours in return. And he ended up being in the highest position of work there, which was serving in the officers' mess. So he didn't waste his time at all. And in fact, there's one cartoon that he drew and sent to Leary during that time, which shows him facing the governor at a desk, and the governor's saying something like, you're in here for 18 months, you cause no trouble, we don't hear anything about you, you do everything we tell you, what's your game, Hollingshead? And that to me is Hollingshead showing that he got the prison officers and warders exactly where he wanted, to the point where he used to have a square of black paper pinned on the wall in his cell, and when people asked what that was, he'd tell them that was his escape portal that he'd go through on a night to show that prison didn't bother him at all. So he came out of prison in late 67. It was broke completely. He couldn't get any money from anywhere. Leary wasn't interested in him at that time, so he went back to Scandinavia, and he spent some time in Norway. Spent a month or so living in Norway, where he was allegedly translating the Icelandic sagas and taking lots of acid. And then he moved into Sweden. I think he went to Oslo, where he hooked up with a woman there who he basically lived off. But during that time, he was also involved with a guy called Simon Spies, who was a Swedish multimillionaire and the first guy to start package holidays from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. Now, Spies was also an exhibitionist, a drug taker, a pornographer, and so on. And he used to invite Hollingshead to his house, he'd party with all the rich and influential in Sweden. And they cooked up a plan whereby they said, if we give if they give Hollingshead lots of money, would he go to London and score loads of acid and bring it back? And this was a few £1,000s, not sure of the exact figure, but it was a lot of money. And of course Hollings said, yeah, I'll do that by all means. So in, I think it was about March 68, Hollingshead boarded a plane to London with several £1,000s belonging to Simon Spies and others, and guess what? He never came back. He took the money, spent a couple of weeks in London, and then flew straight to America to hook up with Leary again.
Right, so their relationship had been healed. Just as a sort of side note, I mean, when you said you've been sent to get acid from the UK, who was making it? People were making it here now.
Oh, by that time, absolutely, definitely. There had been several labs operating in the south of England between early '66 and onwards. And as an aside, this is quite interesting because one of the books I'm currently writing is a history of illicit LSD labs in Britain, and my research has shown that an awful lot of LSD that was in America in '66 and '67 actually had its origins in Britain, which again is quite ironic. So Hollingshead knew where to get acid, whether it was from Britain or in America, and had obviously fooled Simon Spies and said he'd come back with it, but didn't.
So he heads off. He's left, as you say, he's missed these summers of love, but he heads back to the States. And but of course, by this time, Leary is he's public enemy number one, isn't he? And he's kind of like he's in full flow as acid guru. So what was their re-meeting, their kind of, or their reconciliation like?
Well, by all accounts, it was very good. They got on really well together, and Leary invited him to go live with him in San Francisco. So Hollingshead flew out to San Francisco, and he lived with Leary there, and they went to visit all the famous people at the time, Kesey, Jerry Garcia, and so on and so forth. And then shortly after that, they moved to the Brotherhood of Eternal Love's ranch in I can't think of the bloody word, but the Brotherhood of Eternal Love ranch in California, where he spent several months there. That's interesting because his experience there, which he wrote about in his autobiography, he actually admits that he took too much acid. Now, what too much acid for Hollingshead was at that period, I just can't possibly imagine, but it freaked him out a little bit. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love were constantly under surveillance by the FBI, and Hollingshead was getting paranoid, so he disappeared off in the late summer of '68, I think it was, to the Isle of Tonga in the Pacific. Now, the Isle of Tonga, even these days, takes a long time to get to, and it's a very remote place. So in the late '60s, it was very far away, indeed. And we don't know why he went there. It's possibly he was on a scouting mission for a location for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love to move to, but we're not sure. He spent a few weeks there. He turned on a lot of the American Peace Corps there who were doing good works, and was found out by the local police and had to flee Tonga before they arrested him. Came back to America, and in an effort to raise money, he did some work on there's an experimental filmmaker called Scott Bartlett, who was like one of the first American experimental filmmakers, and he was doing a film in 1969 called Moon 1969, all about the attempts to reach the moon. And Hollingshead did some work on that and provided some voiceover, and you can track it down on YouTube, but it's very hard to discern who's saying what. Anyway, Hollingshead did that and made a few $1,000s out of it, and then because he thought, well, Leary's been to India, Alpert's been to India, it must be the place to go, I'll go to Nepal. So in July '69, I think it was, the day that the Apollo rocket blasted off for the moon, he flew to Kathmandu and set up shop in Kathmandu for the best part of a year. And again, he wasn't just laying around smoking chillums. He was wanting to start a cultural centre there for people from the West so they could learn about Nepalese culture. He'd brought loads of acid with him, and he was giving it to all and sundry, which caused loads of freakouts in Kathmandu. And it was there that he met someone who was going to be quite influential on his future life, a Polish guy called Krzysztof, who was a poet and could speak Sanskrit and could understand Sanskrit, and together they started what is probably the first and probably only world's psychedelic poetry magazine called Flow, as in FLOW, and the first issue came out in Nepal in early '70, I think it was. They have many adventures in Nepal, and some of Hollingshead's letters talk about him going off by himself into the hills, being captured by bandits, having to fight them off using only a kettle from the fire, and they're so fantastical that part of me wants to think, no, he's just making that up. But on the other hand, knowing what he has done for fact, I think it's very possibly true. So all these things were going on. But after a while, he tired of Nepal, flew back to Britain, and bizarrely, there's a little piece in the Daily Mail in 1970, which obviously come from Hollingshead's sort of idea of press promotion, saying that he was coming back to Britain and he was going to set up a centre where hippies returning from the East could chill out before they came back into modern day life.
That doesn't sound like a commercial venture.
No, exactly. So what happened then was he went to Scotland where his sister lived, and met some of the local Franciscan monks there, and through them, and this is a very long story short, ended up setting up an encampment in the grounds of the Cathedral of the Isles on the small island of Cumbrae, which is off the west coast of Scotland, not too far from Glasgow. So they set up this commune basically in some huts and some buildings in the cathedral's grounds, and the idea was that Hollingshead and the people who he attracted would work with the monks, and they'd grown their own vegetables, and they'd have quite an austere, ascetic, semi-monastic life, which would then decompress people coming back from the east so they could re-enter sort of Western society, which worked for a few months until, of course, the acid started creeping in, and they started having full moon ceremonies, with banging drums and chanting and things like that. Rumour has it they dosed up one of the monks who wasn't entirely happy about it. And long story short on that one, the police were involved, the bishop came, and I have a transcript of a tape recording of the confrontation between Hollingshead's group of people and the police and the bishop, where they were ordering them off the island. Now, during his time there, the setup that Hollingshead had created was known as the Free High Church of Cumbrae, and various permutations on that. And they had this scroll that they initiated people into, and they got them really high and read out this long scroll, I think, which is in the book, which is just basically a litany of psychedelic plants. So all that was going on, and chaos was descending again. So Hollingshead thought, we've got to get out of this place and move somewhere else. So they got in a van, and they drove to London, visited the incredible string band's commune in Peeblesshire on the way, to no avail. Anyway, got back to London, but on the way back to London, they stopped at a place called Hilton Hall, where Steve Abrams, another very famous counterculture person, was living with various other people such as Jenny Fabian and so on and so forth. Now, there, Steve Abrams and someone else gave Hollingshead and the communards from the Isle of Cumbrae a very, very high dose of something. Hollingshead doesn't know what it was. Nobody who took it who I've spoken to know what it was. It's possible it was either STP, DMT, or just very strong acid. And they all freaked out, and they were climbing the walls, knocking televisions over, and they thought the police was going to have to be called. But they escaped that scrape and moved to London, to the house of the partner of one of the communards from Cumbrae, and set up another version of that commune there up Archway in North London, where they produced some more issues of the magazine Flow. And again, at this time, Hollingshead had started writing his autobiography, but he didn't really write it. Christoph, his very good friend from who had met in Nepal, was actually transcribing tapes that Hollingshead had made and listening to Hollingshead talk and writing it all down, with the intention that Hollingshead would just sort of finesse the end product and Hollingshead would get paid half of the advance. But this didn't come to pass, because in the autumn of, I think it was 72 or 73, Christoph came home one day, went into Hollingshead's room, found him packing his bags, and said, where are you going? And he said, I'm going to America. But what about my half of the, the advance? Yeah, that's not happening. So he completely just ripped off somebody who had been very close to for 2 or 3 years and disappeared off to America with his manuscript.
This is a repeating pattern, isn't it, throughout his life? I mean, we can call it sociopathy or psychopathy. He's just really ruthlessly self-interested. He can get very close to people, but he can just dump them.
Absolutely, this is the thing. His life can be all the segments of Hollingshead's life, and it's quite a picaresque life. The same patterns happen over and over again. He takes people into his confidence. He extracts whatever he can from them, whether that's love, sex, money, material goods, whatever, and then just basically terminates that arrangement and moves on to something else.
I mean, it's worth mentioning too, comes up again and again. I'm fascinated by this myself, the way that the golden dream-like image of late 60s, 67 in particular, 68, and, fueled by acid and other drugs, and the music, the whole culture around it, the counterculture around it, the way that it starts to go dark in the 70s as well. Although, as talking to Joe Banks about Hawkwind a couple of weeks ago, Joe was saying is that it is also the time when a lot of the initiatives, the counterculture initiatives, the political initiatives, that, you know, where the counterculture actually starts to do stuff, also happens in the 70s. And that's kind of reflected in his life as well, isn't it? You know, this idea of setting up communes and, you know, with noble intent, you know, the idea of, you know, a place for returning hippies to kind of like, you know, get their shit together and grow vegetables and you know, do all that. You also see that in the context of the 70s about how the counterculture had evolved then, hadn't it? It had become more social, become more political, you know what I mean? It had become, in some ways, it had become more grounded. And so he's part of that too, until, for whatever reason, he gets bored, restless, or some other impulse takes him and he's off again. I mean, he just couldn't stick to it. He was a restless soul, a rascal, you know, as you know, divine rascal with two sides of him, you know, this kind of wonderful psychedelic prince in some ways, but then also this kind of scummy, horrible, abusive, selfish bastard, really. But what next?
I missed a key part of his story out, actually, because between the island of Cumbria commune experience and going back to London, he conjured up this fantastic idea for an art installation in Edinburgh, which was called Changes 72. Now, what this was Hollingshead and Christoph and many of their people on the Isle of Cumbria were very, very heavily influenced by the I Ching, you know, the Chinese system of divination, throwing yarrow stalks and divining the hexagrams. And Hollingshead and Christoph thought, yeah, wouldn't it be fantastic to create an art installation where people could go and have their I Ching read in a sort of a dramatic environment. So they got in touch with Ricky DeMarco, who ran the Ricky DeMarco Gallery in Edinburgh, which is a very famous art gallery, and arranged to hire a building for a month, 3 weeks I think it was, at the end of January 72. And what they did was they tricked out this building, so it had several rooms, and basically what happened was, and the place was called Changes 72. So if you're a person coming off the street, pardon me, you came in and you went to the reception room, and there was a person sat at the reception desk, and they said, "What is your question?" So you asked them a question. They then pressed a button, and a computer generated a random hexagram which you were given. Then you went into various other rooms which were all filled with mirrors, lights, strange flashing things. It was meant to be quite disorientating, and you went on this journey through this building, through several rooms, until you came into another, the final room, at which there was someone, heavily bearded, sort of mage, sat in a chair, and they then told you what the outcome of your hexagram was. And what he'd done, Hollingshead had got in touch with a computer firm in Newcastle, and again, this is, you know, early 70s, computers were at the very sort of start of their journey, and he'd arranged for them to be able to electronically read the hexagram and come back with a printout of the actual, you know, predictions and results, and the person at the end of this room would read it out, and people had their minds blown, you know, and there are stories of people running out into the street saying, I've never had such an experience in my life. And that lasted for 3 weeks. Now, that's just been lost in history. If that had happened in, say, London, New York or San Francisco, it would be one of the defining achievements of the counterculture, yet very few people know about it, mainly because it was in Edinburgh. But yeah, so
sounds like there's another book in that, Andy, when you get round to it. The History of Psychedelic Scotland. Would absolutely love to read that. But the 70s is rolling on. You know, he's done the autobiography. He's back in the States. Things have changed quite a lot by this time in the States. He's back with Leary, is he? And their relationship's kind of like comes and goes.
For a while, yes. The 70s are. His autobiography was published in 1973, and Hollingshead had high hopes for it. He thought it was going to sort of make him, you know, like the psychedelic guru. But what he hadn't taken into consideration was that by 1973, the thrust of psychedelia was dying, basically. You know, it was, the world was changing, you know, it was all fashion, glam rock, the beginnings of what became disco and cocaine culture and all that sort of thing. And basically, no one was interested in it. It didn't sell very many copies. And this put him into a slough of despond, for want of a better word. And he started getting really heavily, again, into alcohol and heroin, to the point where he was a heavy addict. He moved out to, he lived in Topanga Canyon for a while, and he hooked up with some playwrights there, and he became part of what became known as the University of Hollywood, which is sort of a virtual university that was going to be run by computers, which never really came to pass, but they had a fantastic launch party. And then he thought, what can I do? What can I do to make money and to make my name again? So he started writing for magazines, and he did lots of features for magazines like High Times, for instance, and Stone Age and other hippie magazines in America. And he also started writing for Homegrown in Britain. He was one of the people who were in at the beginning of Homegrown, which is Britain's only drug magazine, started by Lee Harris. Hollingshead had some input into that and early articles. And he also started writing stuff in Omni magazine, which is the old science magazine, which no longer exists. But every one of those things didn't really get anywhere. He fell out with Omni magazine for reasons I could never get to the bottom of. But then, I think it was around sort of the early 80s, he started to get hooked up with Marvel Comics, and he came up with this fantastic idea where he would write the text for a series about the evolution of man, and one of the Marvel comic artists would draw the and do the art for it, and he got paid quite a lot of money in advance payments there. And this basically went downhill, and he completely conned them, and he didn't produce what he was supposed to do. He took the money, and in the end they uncovered him basically, and he was found out to be a complete fraud, and his credibility in America really at that point just went. He had no more friends, no one would trust him, he couldn't get work published, he was descending into alcoholism. He just married or just got together with an Irish woman who was also an alcoholic, so they were basically codependent, and he was at a really bad stage in his life. Then, as often happened with him, somebody threw him a bit of a life belt, and a friend of his called Michael Froelich, who lived in South America, in Bolivia, said, would Hollingshead like to come to stay in my place there and tutor my son? Now, Hollingshead thought that was a fantastic idea, because South America meant cocaine, and Michael liked cocaine, so he disappeared off to South America, and he lived there with Michael Froelich for a bit, and he sent all these letters out about how he was going to start a jojoba plantation and this, that and the other, all of which were complete nonsense according to Michael Froelich. And there may have been some cocaine smuggling plans in there, but I'm not quite sure. But he was drinking heavily, he was getting more and more ill, he was getting very cross with his daughter when he spoke to her on the phone, and it all seemed to be sort of grinding to an end. He developed a stomach ulcer for which he needed hospital treatment for, and basically he died in 1984. Now, the rumours about his death, people have spread all sorts of rumours about his death, about him overdosing on cocaine or being murdered or not even dying at all and just doing a Jim Morrison and flitting off into the jungles or whatever. But I finally tracked down what did happen, and the actual truth of his death is that he was in hospital waiting for surgery or post-surgery for his ulcer, and his girlfriend smuggled him in a bottle of vodka, which he completely drank the whole thing, and it killed him basically. It just affected his surgery, and he just died. So he died in 1984. None of his relatives could afford to go out there to either bring back the body or attend a service, and there was no money available for his burial. So he was actually interred in the German cemetery in a city called Cochabamba, and he was interred in the German cemetery because that was the only one that was secure, because other cemeteries would get grave robbed, and he would have his possessions taken from him. So he was buried there, and I've seen I've got a photograph which is in the book, I think, of the plaque of his final resting place, and it was the end of Michael Hollingshead as a physical being.
But you sort of brought him alive in the book. I mean, it is an amazing read, and he's an amazing life actually, and he's fascinating, baffling, sort of loathsome. Sort of lovable. It's all those things. Together. I mean, what's your feeling about him? Andy, sort of, how do you sort of sum him up? I mean, I suppose in a way, Divine Rascal, the title of your book, is that say, isn't it? I mean, it's impossible to sum up, isn't he? But I think one of the most significant things about him is that, well, you've written the book, but I mean, he's kind of forgotten, really. I mean, he's known as the person who turned Leary on, but kind of that's it, really, isn't it? I mean, in the wider culture.
Well, that was my reason for writing the book, because I thought, the bit about him giving Leary acid is maybe only like a tenth of the stuff that he did. You know, the rest of his life is equally as interesting, even though some of it stems from that meeting. And also because I wanted to try and understand him. And I spent 7 years, I think it was. When I started writing the book, I thought, this will be easy, a couple of years, because I'll be able to find stuff out about him. But more and more kept coming, and I just kept getting deeper into it, and it got to the point where I thought I was thinking like Hollingshead at some points, and it gave me some strange dark thoughts, because I realised that he could be, and was on occasion, a very deeply unpleasant man. But the opposite was also true. He could be lovely and warm and kind and funny and all those sort of things. And he was completely split into these two people. And I was looking all the time I was writing the book for a sort of a way of hanging it all together. And it sort of finally came when I realised that what Hollingshead suffered from all his life was what we now call, the current jargon, adverse childhood experiences. And what happened to him in his very early years, the domestic violence incident that he witnessed and couldn't understand, whatever he did that got him sent to Red Hill School, and that complete separation from his family and people who loved him, basically just messed him up for the rest of his life, because he could never get back to a childhood where he felt wanted and loved, and all his attempts to do it, despite his best efforts, ended in failure. And I find that really, really sad, but equally worthy of chronicling, because the psychedelic culture is always promoted as being, love and peace and everything's fantastic and groovy and everything, but there is another side to it. And Hollingshead himself was quite a sad, tragic character, and the effects they had on several other people who came within his orbit were quite negative. And I thought, there's more and more stuff coming out about psychedelic history, and I always think we have to be truthful and honest about the reality of it, and sometimes the reality of it was pretty ugly, but that doesn't diminish his impact that he had.
Absolutely. I mean, as you know, my interview with Tom O'Neill about the Manson situation, Tate LaBianca murders, acid was a very big part of that. Manson was using a combination of acid and hypnosis, and you don't get much darker than that. I think also we do kind of live in times, don't we, where people are supposed to be either angels or monsters, and it's you can see that with cancel culture and stuff, can't you? It's so characters like this, who would, just difficult to imagine them getting any traction these days because of their behaviour. And he's difficult to understand and difficult to work out, was he a goodie or a baddie, and, why didn't the acid affect him in the way that it affected other people and stuff. And I suppose one of the stable things in his life, apart from acid and drugs, was his friendship with Leary. So just to sort of go full circle, did they stay buddies till the end? I mean, were they still in contact, and did Leary sort of still hold, or could he still light a candle for his old guru, acid guru, Michael Hollingshead?
They certainly kept in contact. I don't have many letters from Leary to Hollingshead in the latter years, but I have many from Hollingshead to Leary, and they were obviously still quite chatty between themselves. And Hollingshead, right up to his final his final letter to Leary, which is like a few weeks before he died, he was trying to encourage Leary to come and stay with him in Cochabamba. So there was obviously still that link. But Leary was like, in a way, he was like Hollingshead in that he moved on from scene to scene, and I think he saw Hollingshead as basically a dead end, and had just kept in contact for old time's sake rather than for anything else.
His life was a sort of psychedelic odyssey, and the book, it's a big book, it's a big life. Sounds like the sort of thing that should be made into a TV series. I mean, you could possibly...
It would make a great film.
I'm not sure you could actually squeeze it into a film. It's like a mini-series. But it doesn't come to a particularly happy ending, is it? And I know that you spent time, or you've certainly been in communication with Vanessa, his daughter, and you said his sister's kind of not disowned him, but doesn't want to talk about him, I guess, which you can understand. I mean, and that. So, what does Vanessa think about him? I mean, what a dad.
Well, this is interesting, because when I sort of first I'd been in touch with Vanessa at the time I was writing Albion Dreaming in the mid 2000s. So I got back in touch with her when I said I was going to write a book, and she was all for it. And then as I discovered more and more negative things about him, I thought, this is going to be difficult, and I really don't want to write something that's going to upset Vanessa because she'd had a bad enough life with him as it was. But to her eternal credit, she was completely magnanimous and said, it's all right, Andy, I understand he was a sociopath, so you write everything sort of warts and all. And she was amazing in providing a couple of unpublished manuscripts that she'd written about her life with him, and loads of photographs and lots of background information. And in fact, it's true to say that book, Divine Rascal, would not be what it was without Vanessa Hollingshead's input. And for people who don't know, Vanessa herself is a leading American comedienne, and if you YouTube Vanessa Hollingshead, you can find loads of her stand-up comedy shows, some of which are about her dad, which are quite entertaining. Not always factual, but quite entertaining. So she was very for it. And also, when I'd finished the manuscript and I sent it to her, I was terrified because I thought, she's not going to like this. But yet she thought it was fantastic because she thought I'd been genuinely honest. There's nothing in the book that is purely opinion. Everything is in some way justified by, some reference or some fact or some interview or everything. So, I think I did the best possible thing I could, and Vanessa appreciated that.
I'm glad to hear it, actually. It is a great book, The Divine Rascal, Strange Attractor Press. An epic work.
Thank you.
Epic life of a deeply, deeply strange individual. So, Andy, thank you so much for walking us through it. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen.
And I think, let's come back. We've got to dig much deeper, I think, into the history of LSD, particularly on these shores. So we'll have Andy back when we can. I hope you enjoyed it, and we hope, of course, that you enjoy all our broadcasts on the subjects of counterculture. You can check them all out if you go to www.bureauoflostculture.com. They will soon all be on iTunes and everywhere else too. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to meeting again next time. I was Stephen Coates, and this was the Bureau of Lost Culture.